The winter wind howled across the lonely valley like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter smell of smoke and ruin. Snow drifted across the broken road leading into the small farming village of Blackridge, but beneath the snow lay the blackened scars of something terrible. Only hours earlier, the village had been alive with laughter, barking dogs, and the quiet sounds of evening chores. Now it was nothing more than a graveyard of burned homes and shattered dreams. Inside the ruins of a small cottage at the edge of the village, a woman struggled to breathe. Her name was Elena Carter, and blood stained the floor beneath her trembling body. Her hands shook violently as she dragged herself across the cold wooden boards. Each breath felt like knives in her chest, but she refused to stop. Not yet. She wasn't fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her daughter. Outside, the sound of distant horses echoed through the valley. The men who had destroyed the village were still nearby, searching the ruins like vultures looking for survivors. Elena knew if they found her daughter, the child would not live to see the sunrise. Her eyes turned toward the small fireplace at the center of the room. The fire had long since died, leaving behind a thick pile of gray ashes. Hidden behind a broken chair was a tiny girl no older than 6. The child's name was Lily. Her small face was covered in tears and soot as she watched her mother crawl across the floor. "Mama," she whispered weakly. Elena forced a smile, though pain twisted across her face. "Shoo, baby," she whispered softly. "You have to be very quiet now." She reached the fireplace and pushed her shaking hands into the ashes. The cold dust clung to her fingers as she dug deeper, clearing space. "Come here," she said gently. Lily crawled toward her, her tiny body trembling with fear. Elena pulled the child into her arms and kissed her dirty hair. "Listen to me very carefully," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than the wind outside. "If something happens to me, you stay here. You stay hidden." Tears streamed down Lily's face. "I don't want you to go, Mama." Elena's heart shattered. But there was no time left for tears. She gently placed the girl inside the fireplace and carefully covered her small body with the cool ashes. "Don't move," Elena whispered. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Lily nodded weakly. Elena brushed the ashes lightly across the child's hair and face until she blended perfectly with the dark pile. The sound of hooves suddenly grew louder outside. Elena froze. They were coming. She forced herself to stand, though her legs trembled beneath her weight. Blood continued dripping from the wound in her side. She staggered toward the front door just as it burst open. 3 armed men stepped inside. Their leader wore a black coat and a cruel smile. "Well, looks like we missed one," he said coldly. Elena stood between them and the fireplace. "You've taken everything," she said weakly. "What more do you want?" The man stepped closer. "We want to make sure no witnesses survive." Elena felt her strength fading. But she would not move. Not even one step. Not while her daughter was still breathing. The man sighed. Then he drew his revolver. A single gunshot shattered the silence. Elena collapsed to the floor. The men searched the house quickly, kicking through broken furniture and overturned tables. One of them approached the fireplace. For a moment, Lily felt her entire world stop. The man looked down at the ashes, then shrugged. "Nothing here," he muttered. Minutes later the men rode away, their laughter fading into the distance. Silence returned to the ruined valley. The wind continued to blow through the broken village. Inside the cottage, the ashes in the fireplace began to move. A tiny hand slowly pushed upward. Lily crawled out, coughing and shaking. "Mama," she whispered. But Elena Carter would never answer again. The little girl curled beside her mother's body and cried until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. Hours passed. Snow slowly covered the village. But just before dawn, the quiet sound of boots crunching through snow echoed along the road. A tall man approached the ruined settlement leading a horse behind him. His coat was old and dusted with frost, and his wide hat shadowed a face hardened by years of solitude. The villagers would have called him a farmer. But they would have been wrong. Because this man had once been something far more dangerous. His name was Daniel Hayes. And he had spent years trying to forget the life he used to live. Daniel walked slowly through the village ruins, his sharp eyes studying every detail. Burned homes. Spent cartridges. Boot prints. This was no accident. This was slaughter. Then he heard it. A faint sound. Almost too quiet to notice. A child's weak cough. Daniel froze. He followed the sound toward the destroyed cottage at the edge of the village. When he pushed the door open, his eyes fell upon the heartbreaking sight inside. A dead woman. And a tiny girl covered in ashes sitting beside her. The girl looked up with frightened eyes. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Lily whispered the words that would change Daniel Hayes' life forever. "Please, don't leave me." Something deep inside the man's chest tightened. Daniel had buried his past long ago. But in that moment he knew something with terrifying certainty. The men who had done this would return. And if they did, they would find that the quiet farmer who rescued the little girl was not the helpless man they expected. Because Daniel Hayes had once been the most feared gunman in the entire territory. And some ghosts never stay buried forever. The morning sun slowly rose over the burned village, casting pale light across the snow-covered ruins. The valley was silent except for the soft wind brushing across broken wood and blackened stones. Daniel Hayes stood inside the small cottage, staring at the lifeless woman on the floor and the fragile child sitting beside her. The girl looked as if the world had collapsed around her. Her face was pale beneath the ash covering her skin. Her clothes were torn and far too thin for the bitter cold. But what struck Daniel the most was not the dirt or the fear. It was the emptiness in her eyes. A child should never look like that. Daniel slowly knelt beside her. "What's your name, kid?" he asked gently. The little girl hesitated. "Lily," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "I'm Daniel." She glanced toward the door nervously. "They might come back," she said quietly. Daniel's eyes hardened slightly. "Who did this?" Lily swallowed and looked down. "Men on horses. They burned the houses, they hurt everyone." Her small voice began shaking. "They hurt my mama." Daniel felt a heavy weight settle inside his chest. He had seen many things in his life. Too many things. But the sight of a child sitting beside her murdered mother was something no man could ever get used to. He stood and gently placed his coat around Lily's shoulders. "We're leaving," he said. The girl hesitated and looked back at her mother. Daniel followed her gaze. For a moment, the hardened man who had once faced countless gunfights stood quietly in respect. Then he removed his hat. "I'm sorry," he murmured. He carefully wrapped the woman's body in a blanket from the corner of the room and carried her outside. The ground was frozen, but Daniel used a shovel he found in a nearby shed and began digging slowly. It took nearly an hour. Lily stood nearby, silent and watching. When the grave was finished, Daniel gently lowered the woman into the earth. He placed a wooden board at the head of the grave. Then he looked down at Lily. "You want to say something?" The little girl stepped forward slowly. "Mama always said God watches over us," she whispered. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "So please watch over her now." Daniel felt something tighten in his throat. He placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "We should go." They began walking toward his horse when Daniel suddenly stopped. His eyes had fallen on something in the snow. Fresh tracks. Horse tracks. And they were not old. Daniel slowly crouched and studied them carefully. 5 riders. Maybe 6. Heading toward the valley road. But what made Daniel's expression darken was the direction of the tracks. They were circling back. The men who destroyed the village were returning. Daniel stood slowly. His eyes were no longer the calm eyes of a quiet farmer. They were the cold eyes of a man who had once lived by the gun. "Lily," he said quietly. "Yes. You stay behind me no matter what happens." Fear crossed the girl's face. "Are they coming back?" Daniel looked toward the distant ridge. "Yes." He lifted Lily onto his horse and guided her behind a large fallen tree. "Stay here," he said. "But trust me." The girl nodded. Daniel then walked back toward the center of the ruined village. He removed an old rifle from the saddle and checked the chamber. Then he reached beneath his coat and pulled out a revolver. For years he had sworn never to use it again. But some promises are impossible to keep. A cloud of dust appeared on the ridge moments later. The riders had returned. 6 men rode into the destroyed village, laughing as if the massacre had been nothing more than a game. Their leader, the man in the black coat, spotted Daniel standing alone in the road. "Well now," the man said with a grin. "Looks like we missed someone." The other men chuckled. Daniel said nothing. The leader tilted his head. "You a farmer?" Daniel's voice was calm. "Something like that." The man laughed. "Well, farmer, today's your unlucky day." He reached for his revolver. But he was far too slow. Daniel's gun fired first. The crack of the shot echoed across the valley. The leader fell from his horse instantly. Chaos erupted. The remaining men grabbed their weapons, but Daniel moved like a ghost. Years of deadly experience guided every motion. Another shot. Another rider fell. A third man tried to flee, but Daniel's rifle struck him before he reached the edge of the village. Within seconds, the laughter of the outlaws had turned into terrified shouting. 2 men remained. They tried to charge him together. Daniel stepped aside calmly and fired twice. Both men collapsed in the snow. Then silence returned to the valley once again. Daniel slowly lowered his revolver. The gun smoke drifted into the cold air. Behind the fallen tree, Lily watched everything with wide eyes. She slowly stepped forward. "Are they gone?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." The girl looked at him with amazement. "You're not just a farmer." Daniel sighed. "No." She hesitated before asking the next question. "Are you a bad man?" For a moment, Daniel looked at the bodies scattered across the snow. Then he knelt beside her. "I was once," he admitted quietly. "But I'm trying not to be anymore." Lily thought about that for a moment. Then she did something Daniel had not expected. She hugged him. The small child wrapped her arms tightly around his coat. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered. Daniel froze. No one had hugged him in many years. Slowly, awkwardly, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said. Hours later, Daniel placed Lily on the horse and began riding away from the ruined village. Snow continued falling gently behind them, slowly covering the past. Lily held tightly onto his coat. "Where are we going?" she asked. Daniel looked toward the distant mountains. "Somewhere better," he replied. She smiled faintly. For the first time since the terrible night, hope returned to her eyes. And as the two disappeared down the long road, the valley that had once witnessed tragedy now held the quiet beginning of something new. A second chance. For both of them. End of story.